The incident. The Langston estate stood on the crest of a hill like a fortress of glass and stone. At dusk, its tall windows reflected the last light of the day, painting streaks of molten gold across the polished marble floors inside. The rain had begun earlier, tapping insistently against the panes, then escalating into a storm that rattled the house with its force. Inside, however, the estate remained a world apart, clean, orderly, and suffocatingly silent. Maya Williams had been working there for nearly 6 months, but every evening still felt like a test she might fail. She moved swiftly through the corridors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble. Her uniform, a simple navy dress with a crisp white apron, was neat, though the long hours and endless tasks had worn the fabric thin. She carried herself with quiet dignity, even though she had grown used to the stares of the other staff. Stares that whispered she didn't belong. In the nursery, the air was warm with the scent of lavender. Toys were lined up in meticulous order along the shelves, cars sorted by color, blocks stacked by size, picture books standing upright in perfect sequence. But on the floor, all that order was undone by a single child. Leo Langston, 5 years old, sat cross-legged near the window. His small hands gripped a wooden block tightly, tapping it again and again against his knee. He was beautiful, with his father's strong jaw softened into a cherubic roundness, his mother's golden curls falling into his eyes. But his gaze was distant, turned inward, as if his thoughts traveled in a world unreachable to most. His humming filled the air, rhythmic and low, his body rocking slightly with each sound. Maya crouched a few feet away, her voice gentle. "Leo, sweetheart, would you like me to read your book? The one with the little bear?" The boy did not answer. His tapping grew faster. Maya tried again, softer still. "Okay, I'll just sit right here. If you want me to read, you can bring it to me." She smiled faintly, folding her hands in her lap. Patience. That was the key she had learned with Leo. No rushing, no pushing. The boy needed safety more than instruction, calm more than control. And though Maya's life had taught her to hurry, to keep up, to keep quiet, to prove her worth, she found herself slowing down for him, her heart expanding with every small victory they shared. But tonight something was different. The storm outside seemed to mirror Leo's unease. His rocking grew erratic. His hum deepened into a distressed moan. He slapped the block against the floor, then against his own forehead with a sharp thud. Maya's chest tightened. "Leo, no, baby, don't do that." She slid closer, careful not to startle him. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm right here." But the boy's panic had already surged beyond words. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling into the cabinet by the wall. His forehead struck the sharp corner with a sickening crack. Blood blossomed instantly, a red streak against pale skin. "Leo," Maya cried, rushing forward. She pulled him into her arms, cradling his small body against her chest. He thrashed, kicking, but she held on tightly, rocking him, whispering, "Shh, it's okay. I've got you. You're safe. You're safe." Warm blood trickled across her sleeve, seeping into the fabric. Her heart pounded as she pressed a handkerchief against his wound, murmuring soothing sounds between frantic prayers. That was when the door burst open. Richard Langston filled the frame like a storm-given form. His tall figure was draped in a rain-soaked coat, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes blazing with a fury that froze Maya in place. "What did you do to my son?" His voice cracked through the air like thunder. Maya's mouth opened, but no words came at first. Her hands trembled as she tightened her hold on Leo, who whimpered and buried his face deeper into her chest. "Answer me." Richard's shout reverberated against the nursery walls. He stormed forward, his polished shoes squeaking on the marble. "God, his head, he's bleeding. What have you done?" Maya's lips quivered. "No, no, sir, please listen." He had a moment. He was overwhelmed. He ran into the cabinet before I could. "Shut up." Richard's roar shook the room. His hand shot out, grabbing the nearest chair and hurling it across the space. It splintered against the wall, shards scattering like shrapnel. Maya flinched violently. Tears burned behind her eyes. "I swear, Mr. Langston, I threw myself over him to stop. You're supposed to protect him." His voice cracked with anguish. He stared down at the small boy in her arms, his chest heaving. "And now look at him, my God." Leo whimpered again, his small hand clutching Maya's apron. The staff had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. The head housekeeper, a few maids, 2 bodyguards. Their eyes darted between the billionaire and the trembling maid. "Sir," the housekeeper said cautiously, "shall we take Leo to the hospital?" "Yes," Richard snapped, pointing to a guard. "Now, call ahead full pediatric trauma response." Maya rose shakily, still holding Leo. Her voice broke as she pleaded, "Please, sir. You must believe me, he was panicking. He hurt himself. I tried to stop him." But before she could finish, Richard's open palm struck her across the face. The sound rang out sharp and cruel, echoing off the marble. Maya crumpled to the floor, her cheek swelling instantly, her lips splitting. She caught herself on one hand, the other still clinging desperately to Leo. Gasps erupted from the doorway. "You don't touch my son again." Richard's words were low, venomous. Maya's breath hitched. Her voice came out in a broken whisper. "I didn't hurt him. I swear to God I didn't." "Save it," one of the maids sneered. "We all saw the blood." "Probably snapped," another muttered. "Girls like her don't belong here anyway." Maya's vision blurred with tears, not from pain but from disbelief. She pressed her sleeve against her lip, trembling. The guard gently pried Leo from her arms. The boy whimpered, reaching back for her, but was quickly carried out toward the waiting SUV. The sound of the vehicle's tires screeching into the storm filled the night, and Maya was left behind, alone, crumpled on the cold marble, the taste of blood and salt in her mouth. Hours dragged on. She sat curled at the base of the wall, her apron stained with blood, her face aching, her body shivering. No one came to check on her. The staff passed by with cold glances, whispers trailing in her wake. When the great doors of the estate finally opened again, it was near midnight. Richard returned, drenched and exhausted, a hospital folder clutched in his hand. His footsteps echoed down the hall until he disappeared into his study. There, in the dim glow of a desk lamp, he collapsed into his chair, his breath ragged. He flipped open the report. Minor laceration, no fracture, stitches applied, child stable. Relief flickered briefly in his eyes before guilt settled heavy on his shoulders. On the wall above his desk, a security monitor glowed faintly. Richard lifted the remote with trembling hands, scrolling through the footage. He replayed the evening in real time, then slowed it down, and there it was. The truth. Leo pacing, rocking, overwhelmed. Leo slamming his head against the cabinet. Maya lunging, wrapping her arms around him, shielding him from further harm, whispering into his hair with desperate tenderness. Every movement, every effort captured in merciless detail. Richard's jaw slackened. The rage that had driven him burned away, leaving only the ash of shame. His hand covered his face as he whispered, "God, what have I done?" The image of Maya's tear-streaked face rose in his mind. The sound of his slap echoed again in his memory, not with satisfaction, but with sickening clarity, and for the first time in years, since the night he lost his wife, Richard Langston felt something break inside him. Not anger, not control, but guilt. The kind that claws deep, that leaves a man sleepless, that whispers he has become the very monster he vowed never to be. The revelation. The rain had subsided by morning, leaving the Langston estate wrapped in a fog that clung to the gardens and blurred the skyline beyond the iron gates. The storm's violence was gone, but its residue lingered in the damp chill that settled into the walls of the mansion. Inside, the grand house carried an air of silence too heavy to be natural. Even the staff, usually brisk in their morning duties, moved about cautiously as if the echoes of last night's uproar still haunted every polished corner of marble. Maya had not slept. After hours on the cold floor of the nursery corridor, she had dragged herself to the small servants' quarters where she lay fully clothed on her cot, staring into the darkness. Her cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. Her lips stung each time she swallowed, and yet the physical pain was not what carved deepest into her. It was the echo of the accusation, the look in Richard Langston's eyes when he had struck her, and the merciless judgment from the others who stood in the doorway and decided she was guilty without a word of defense. No one had come to her aid. No one had believed her. And though she had endured hardships before, humiliation, prejudice, long hours, and unkind words, something about this particular night left her spirit trembling as though she had been stripped of more than her dignity. Still, when dawn arrived, Maya tied her apron and went about her work. She had no luxury to wallow. The staff hierarchy left no room for weakness. Already she could feel the glances, hear the whispers that trailed after her. That's the one, they murmured. The maid who hurt the boy. She pressed her lips together and carried on, polishing silver trays in the kitchen, scrubbing glass vases in the drawing room, dusting the endless shelves of books in the library. She clung to the rhythm of work like a lifeline, but each time she closed her eyes, she saw Leo's face pale and streaked with blood, and felt the helpless shudder of his small body in her arms. Upstairs, Richard Langston sat at his mahogany desk, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the dim glow of the security monitor. He had barely slept either. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see contracts, boardrooms, or the sprawling empire of real estate and investments that had made him one of the most powerful men in the city. He saw only two images: his son's terrified whimper and the sharp recoil of Maya's head as his hand struck her. That moment replayed relentlessly, growing heavier with each repetition. The footage had told him the truth. Every frame had dismantled the story his rage had conjured. Maya had not harmed his son. She had fought desperately to shield him. Even as blood smeared across her sleeve, she had not let go. She had not cried for help. She had simply held Leo, whispering over and over, trying to calm him. Richard had watched the video half a dozen times, at first unwilling to accept what was so plainly there. Now, with the clarity of dawn, guilt pressed down on him like a weight he could not shrug away. For years, Richard had lived in control of every detail. The empire he built did not tolerate weakness. His employees feared him, his competitors envied him, and the media painted him as the untouchable tycoon who weathered every storm. But last night had shattered the image he carried of himself. His fury had made him blind, and in that blindness he had struck an innocent woman who had shown nothing but care for his son. His son. That thought was a wound deeper still. Richard leaned back, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. Since Clara's death, the accident that stole his wife and left Leo motherless, he had thrown himself into work, pouring every ounce of grief into building higher towers. Bigger deals, stronger walls against the chaos of life. But those walls had not protected his son. Leo had retreated inward, lost in a world Richard could not navigate. Doctors and therapists spoke in terms of progress and patience, but Richard only saw failure. Every meltdown, every withdrawn silence reminded him that he had failed at the one role that mattered more than all others: being a father. And yet, in the months since Maya had come, something had shifted. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, Leo had begun to change. He ate meals more steadily when she encouraged him. He tolerated sounds that once sent him spiraling. He even laughed, soft, fleeting, but real, when she read to him in her gentle voice. Richard had noticed these things from a distance, though pride had kept him from acknowledging them. Now, watching the footage, he realized what he had refused to admit. Maya had been a lifeline for his son, not a danger. She had given him something Richard's money, power, and even his desperate determination could not provide. Still, pride and shame warred within him. To admit he had been wrong meant facing not just Maya but himself, the kind of man he had become since Clara's death. He had lashed out at the only person who had stood faithfully by Leo's side. He had raised his hand against her when she least deserved it. No amount of wealth could erase the memory of that sound, the sharp crack of his palm against her cheek. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Margaret, the head housekeeper, carrying a tray of coffee. She set it down without meeting his eyes. The silence between them stretched heavy. Finally, Richard spoke. "How is she?" Margaret paused. "The maid? She's working, sir." As usual, Richard's jaw tightened. "Her name is Maya," he said quietly. Margaret blinked, startled by the correction. "Yes, sir, Maya. Did anyone tend to her injuries?" There was a hesitation, then a reluctant shake of the head. "No, sir, she seemed to prefer being left alone." Richard swallowed the sharp retort that rose in his throat. Alone. Of course she had been left alone. He had made certain of it with his public condemnation. The staff had taken his fury as a verdict, and Maya had been cast out without trial. He set his jaw and dismissed Margaret with a curt nod. When the door closed again, he rose from his chair and crossed to the window. Outside, the fog swirled over the gardens, blurring the lines between stone statues and hedges, between path and wilderness. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. A man of wealth and power, but also a man hollowed by grief, marred by his own anger. For the first time in years, Richard Langston felt powerless. Hours passed before he finally left his study. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as he made his way toward the servants' wing. He had never once stepped foot there before. Why would he? His world and theirs rarely intersected beyond formal commands. Yet now each step felt weighted with something he could not name. At the door to Maya's small room, he hesitated. He could hear faint movements within, the soft clink of porcelain, the sweep of fabric as she moved. His hand hovered over the doorframe. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" seemed too shallow, too weak. Nothing could undo the violence of his mistrust. Nothing could erase the humiliation she had endured. And yet silence was worse. He knocked once, firmly but not harshly. Inside, Maya froze. For a moment she did not move, hoping perhaps that whoever stood there would leave. But when the knock came again, she straightened her apron, wiped her swollen lip with the back of her hand, and opened the door. There he was, the billionaire. The man who ruled this house, the man whose hand had left its mark on her face. His eyes, however, were not burning with rage now. They were heavy, shadowed, almost weary. "Maya," he said quietly. She did not answer, only held the door slightly ajar, her posture tense, ready to close it at the slightest provocation. He faltered, the words catching in his throat. For a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals with ease, it was an unfamiliar thing to be at a loss. "I owe you an apology." Maya's breath caught, though her expression remained guarded. She had not expected those words, not from him. "I was wrong," Richard continued, his voice low. "I didn't see what really happened. I let my anger blind me. And in that blindness, I hurt you. I cannot take that back, but I can tell you the truth. I know you didn't harm my son. You tried to protect him. The camera showed me everything." Silence stretched between them. Maya's eyes shimmered, but not with gratitude. With exhaustion. With disbelief. She had no energy left for anger or forgiveness. He's all I have left," Richard said almost to himself. "When I saw the blood, I wasn't thinking. I was afraid, and I took that fear out on you. I am sorry, Maya, truly." Her grip on the door tightened. She wanted to believe him. But the sting on her cheek reminded her that words were easier than restraint. "It doesn't change what happened," she whispered. "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "But I want to make it right." She shook her head faintly. "You can't, not with me. Just take care of your son. That's all that matters." With that, she closed the door softly but firmly. Richard stood in the corridor staring at the painted wood, his hand clenched at his side. He had faced down rivals who threatened his empire, politicians who sought to break his will, crises that would cripple lesser men. Yet here, outside the room of a maid, he felt utterly undone. Inside, Maya leaned against the door, her knees trembling. She slid slowly to the floor, pressing her palms over her face. His apology should have meant something, should have eased the wound. But all she felt was the same hollowness as the night before. Still, neither of them realized that the path had already shifted. For though mistrust and hurt now separated them, the truth had planted a seed. Richard had seen her strength, her patience, her devotion to Leo. And no matter how much pride or shame tried to bury it, he could no longer deny. Healing moments. The days following the storm settled into an uneasy quiet at the Langston estate. Outwardly, nothing appeared different. The staff went about their duties with their usual precision. The household routines carried on as though the previous night's chaos had been an aberration. But beneath the polished surface, undercurrents of tension and watchfulness flowed. The maids whispered when Maya passed, their suspicion not fully erased by Richard's sudden silence on the matter. They looked for confirmation of their prejudice in every movement she made, every word she spoke, and found it in shadows of their own invention. Maya, for her part, kept her head down. She spoke little, worked diligently, and tried not to let her trembling hands betray the exhaustion that dogged her. Yet when it came to Leo, she could not remain distant. No matter the sting of humiliation or the burn of mistrust in the eyes around her, something in her heart refused to yield when it came to him. She could not forget his small arms wrapped around her in panic, his fragile voice humming against her chest. He needed her. And though she was no more than a servant in that house, she would not abandon him to loneliness and fear. It began in small ways. She returned to the nursery the morning after the accident, though no one had instructed her to. The cabinet corner had been padded, the floor freshly polished, but the air still held the faint trace of lavender and blood. Leo sat on the rug, his stitches a faint line across his forehead, his fingers tracing circles in the fibers as though memorizing their texture. His eyes darted toward her when she entered, wary but curious. Maya lowered herself to the floor, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She did not reach for him. Instead, she opened one of his books, resting it on her lap. "Would you like to hear about the bear again?" she asked gently. For a long moment, there was no response. Then slowly, Leo shuffled closer, his small hands gripping the hem of her apron as though testing her presence. Maya's heart swelled. She began to read, her voice low and melodic, careful not to startle him. As the story unfolded, she shifted her tone for each character, exaggerating the bear's growl and the rabbit's squeak. To her quiet joy, Leo let out a soft sound, something between a sigh and a laugh, as if the world of the story gave him a moment of release. From that morning, the healing moments grew. Not every day was progress. Some were marked by meltdowns, silences, or resistance. But Maya learned to celebrate the smallest victories. A smile when she offered him his favorite toy, a word whispered in imitation of hers, a hand extended for comfort rather than withdrawn in fear. She never forced, never demanded. She simply waited, patient as the rain that carved valleys into stone. Richard noticed. At first he observed from a distance a silent figure in the doorway of the playroom or the hall outside the nursery. He told himself he was ensuring his son's safety, that his watchfulness was a duty, not an indulgence. Yet the longer he stood there, the more he found himself studying not Leo but Maya. The way her eyes softened with every word she spoke to the boy, the way her patience did not falter, even when his cries rang sharp enough to rattle the windows, the way she celebrated each fragile breakthrough as though it were a triumph worthy of a parade. One evening, he found himself lingering longer than usual, unseen as Maya coaxed Leo into stacking blocks. The boy hesitated at first, his small hand trembling as he placed one atop the other. Maya clapped softly, her face alight with joy. "You did it. Look how tall it's getting." Leo's lips curved in the faintest smile, his eyes flickering toward her as though seeking confirmation that it was real. Richard felt his chest tighten, a pang so unfamiliar it startled him. For months he had struggled to break through his son's silence, frustrated by every wall autism seemed to raise. Yet here was Maya, a maid with no formal training, opening doors with nothing more than patience and love. Later that night, Richard sat in his study with a glass of scotch untouched beside him. His mind replayed the image of Leo's tentative smile, Maya's quiet triumph. He should have felt relief, perhaps even gratitude, but what he felt most was a gnawing sense of inadequacy. For all his wealth, his influence, his relentless determination, he had been powerless where she succeeded. He was a man who commanded skyscrapers but could not summon a single smile from his son. This realization unsettled him, yet it also drew him closer to her presence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began adjusting his schedule. Meetings ended earlier, late-night calls were postponed, and dinners once taken in solitude were eaten nearer the nursery. He told himself it was for Leo, that he wanted to witness his son's progress. But deep down he knew it was also to witness her. Still, Richard was not ready to admit admiration. He remained distant, often curt when they crossed paths. Yet when he caught glimpses of her in unguarded moments, her head bent over a storybook, her laughter when Leo surprised her with a new word, the tenderness with which she tucked him into bed, something inside him shifted. His anger had burned itself into ashes, and from those ashes, an unexpected tenderness stirred. The staff noticed too. Their gossip shifted tones. At first they had sneered at Maya, muttering about her supposed guilt. Now confusion crept into their whispers. They saw Leo's visible progress, saw the boy who once shrank from touch now reaching for her hand. Some scoffed, unwilling to yield their prejudice. Others softened, though never openly. But Maya paid them no mind. Her world narrowed to the boy who trusted her, and the quiet moments that stitched healing into their days. One evening, as twilight spilled amber light through the tall windows, Maya found herself seated on the rug while Leo pressed blocks into her hands. She stacked them as he directed, each piece added carefully under his watchful eye. When the tower finally toppled, Leo let out a sound that startled them both. Laughter, genuine, unrestrained, bubbling from his chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Maya gasped, tears pricking her eyes. "You laughed," she whispered, clapping her hands together. "Leo, you laughed." From the doorway, Richard froze. The sound was so rare, so precious, that for a moment he could not breathe. He leaned heavily against the frame, his eyes locked on his son, his throat thick with emotion he had long buried. It was as though a forgotten melody had returned, one he thought he would never hear again. When Maya glanced up and saw him there, their eyes met. For the first time since the night of the accident, there was no accusation in his gaze, no suspicion, no anger, only something raw and unguarded, gratitude, admiration, and something else he could not yet name. Maya looked away quickly, focusing back on Leo, but the image lingered in Richard's mind long after. That night, as he sat once more in his silent study, he realized that Maya had given him more than proof of his son's resilience. She had stirred something long dormant in him, something softer, more human, something he feared to feel yet could no longer deny. Breaking barriers, the Langston estate was never short of guests. Its long drive, lined with ancient oaks and wrought iron lamps, often glittered with the headlights of sleek cars carrying business associates, old money acquaintances, and ambitious socialites eager to bask in the glow of Richard Langston's influence. To the outside world, the house was a symbol of power, a citadel of privilege where every polished surface whispered wealth. But within its grand halls, Maya discovered that riches did not guarantee kindness, nor did status shield one from cruelty. Her days settled into a rhythm, caring for Leo, managing her assigned chores, keeping to the corners of the mansion where she could pass unnoticed. Yet no matter how quietly she moved, the whispers trailed behind her like smoke. Among the staff, suspicion had not fully died after the incident. Some admitted grudgingly that the boy was improving, but their prejudice clung stubbornly, reshaping itself into sly remarks and dismissive stares. She was tolerated, not embraced, and every glance seemed to remind her of her place. The divide became sharper when Richard's inner circle took notice. At dinners and gatherings, when crystal glasses chimed and polished laughter filled the air, word spread of the maid who had somehow captured Leo's trust. Guests who noticed the boy's calmer demeanor or heard the faint sound of his laughter were quick to inquire, and Richard, though reluctant, could not deny Maya's role. What began as curiosity soon sharpened into criticism. "She's untrained," remarked one of Richard's longtime associates, a woman whose diamonds glittered as sharply as her tone. "Children like Leo require specialists, therapists, not household staff." Her words were coded in civility, but her glance at Maya, standing discreetly at the edge of the room with a tray, was pointed and dismissive. Another guest, swirling his wine with casual arrogance, added, "It's dangerous, Richard. You can't entrust your only son to someone like her. What if the incident repeats? You have too much to lose." Their voices reached Maya even when they pretended they did not. She kept her eyes lowered, her expression calm, but inside, each word was a stone hurled against her already bruised spirit. She did not seek their approval, nor had she asked for their recognition, but the sting of their disdain was impossible to ignore. What they failed to see, what they refused to acknowledge, was the quiet bond growing between her and Leo. The boy who once flinched at every sound now took her hand, willingly, when they walked through the gardens. The child who resisted food now allowed her to feed him spoon by spoon, sometimes even laughing when she made silly faces to encourage him. These small miracles were invisible to those who measured worth by pedigree and training, but they were miracles nonetheless, carved from patience and trust. Richard, however, saw them, and though he had once doubted, once lashed out in blindness, now he found himself bristling at every insult aimed in her direction. The transformation unsettled him at first. He had spent years building his reputation on control, on never yielding to emotion in boardrooms or ballrooms alike. Yet now, when he heard the veiled remarks, something in him flared with quiet anger. One evening, during a dinner party crowded with investors and old family acquaintances, the conversation drifted again to Leo. A guest praised the boy's noticeable calmness, remarking that he seemed less withdrawn than before. Another, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, asked, "And who is responsible for this newfound progress?" "Not that maid, surely." The room chuckled politely, but Richard did not. He set his glass down with deliberate care, his gaze sweeping the table until it fell on the speaker. "Her name," he said evenly, "is Maya Williams. And yes, she is responsible." A hush fell over the table. The casual arrogance that usually met his statements wavered, unsettled by the firmness in his tone. "She has done for Leo what no specialist, no therapist, no wealth of mine has managed," Richard continued. His voice was calm, but beneath it simmered a conviction none of them had seen in him before. "She has given him trust. She has given him safety. If you cannot see the value in that, then you do not understand my son." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain as guests shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at one another, astonished by the vehemence in his defense. Others frowned, their prejudices bruised by his open acknowledgement. But Richard did not care. For once he had spoken not as a businessman but as a father, and as a man who had begun to respect the strength of someone they dismissed. From her place near the doorway, Maya heard his words. She kept her face composed, her eyes lowered, but inside her heart fluttered with a confusion she could not name. Gratitude, perhaps. Surprise, certainly, but also something deeper. A fragile warmth that unsettled her as much as it comforted her. The days that followed brought more challenges. Not all the staff softened. Some grew colder, their resentment sharpening as they sensed the shift in Richard's regard. A few were openly hostile, muttering under their breath or leaving tasks undone in petty retaliation. Maya endured it all with quiet dignity. She had faced worse in her life. She had weathered storms of poverty, prejudice, and heartbreak before. This was simply another wall to endure. Yet she was not entirely alone anymore. Slowly, Richard began to intervene in ways that startled even him. When a maid spoke sharply to Maya within his hearing, he corrected her with a firmness that left no room for doubt. When assignments were unfairly piled upon her, he redistributed tasks without explanation. These gestures were small, but they did not go unnoticed. For Maya, they were both a relief and a burden. She did not want favoritism, nor did she wish to fuel further resentment among the others. Yet she could not deny that his quiet defense eased the weight she carried. Still, she remained cautious. She knew better than to mistake respect for redemption, or kindness for trust. Her place in the Langston household was fragile, and she could not afford to forget it. But Richard's view of her had already shifted irreversibly. He no longer saw a servant on the margins of his estate. He saw the woman who had cradled his bleeding son with more devotion than anyone else in the room. He saw the patience that had coaxed laughter from silence, the courage that had endured disdain without faltering. And though he had once believed barriers of class and wealth to be impenetrable, he now found himself questioning them. One night, after the house had quieted, Richard stood at the threshold of the nursery. Inside, Maya sat by Leo's bed, her hand resting lightly on the boy's arm as she hummed a lullaby. The soft melody wove through the shadows, wrapping the room in a peace Richard had not felt in years. He watched silently, unseen as Leo's breathing slowed, his small body relaxing into sleep. Maya's eyes were closed, her lips curved in a faint smile, as though the act of singing brought her as much comfort as it did the child. Richard felt something stir within him, something he had long buried beneath ambition and grief. Respect, yes. Gratitude, certainly. But also a tenderness that unsettled him, a recognition of a strength he had once dismissed. He knew the world outside those walls would never understand. His circle would never accept it. His staff might never embrace it. But in that moment, none of it mattered. For the first time since Clara's death, Richard allowed himself to wonder if healing was possible, not only for his son, but for himself. And though he could not yet name it, he knew that Maya Williams was at the heart of it. A father's awakening, autumn arrived with a quiet majesty that swept across the Langston estate. The oaks that lined the drive turned amber and crimson, scattering their leaves across the lawns like a tapestry woven by the season itself. The air carried a sharpness, a crispness that whispered of change, of endings and beginnings entwined. To Richard, autumn had always been Clara's favorite time of year. She loved the way the city softened beneath the weight of falling leaves, the way the earth seemed to pause before the rush of winter. She would take Leo, then only a toddler, into the gardens and fill his small fists with leaves, laughing as he squealed at their crackle. It had been one of the rare times Richard had allowed himself to slow down and join them. He remembered her laughter, clear, melodic, utterly unburdened, and the memory was now both a balm and a knife. For years he had avoided these recollections. Work had been his refuge, the skyscrapers and contracts and endless negotiations a fortress against the ache of loss. He told himself he had no time for grief, that he could not indulge in sorrow when there were empires to maintain. Yet the truth was simpler. He had been afraid that if he let grief in, it would devour him, and so he had shut it out, building walls so high that even Leo could not reach him. But now, in the quiet presence of Maya Williams, those walls began to crack. It happened not with thunderous revelation, but with quiet persistence, the way sunlight slips through curtains, soft but relentless. She did not speak of Clara, nor of grief, nor of the wounds that lay between father and son. Yet through her patience with Leo, through the small miracles she nurtured, she forced Richard to look at what he had avoided. Each time he saw his son smile, each time he heard his laugh, he was confronted not only with the boy's resilience but also with his own absence. One evening, Richard found himself lingering in the playroom. Maya sat on the rug with Leo, arranging wooden animals in a circle. She gave each one a voice, silly, exaggerated accents that made Leo giggle, and for a moment the boy's laughter filled the room like music. Richard stood in the doorway, his chest tight, his throat burning with something he could not name. When Maya looked up and saw him, she offered a soft smile, one that carried no judgment, only quiet acknowledgement. "Would you like to join us?" she asked. The question startled him. He, Richard Langston, had never been invited into such a simple scene. Boardrooms, yes. Negotiations, certainly. But a child's game of wooden animals? That belonged to a world he had abandoned long ago. His instinct was to refuse, to retreat behind the safety of dignity. Yet Leo's eyes had turned toward him, wide, expectant, waiting. Richard stepped into the room. He lowered himself onto the rug, awkward in his tailored suit, his movements stiff. Maya handed him a small wooden lion. "This one is yours." For a moment he simply held it, feeling foolish. But when Leo giggled and reached for the lion, Richard cleared his throat and rumbled in a deep voice, "I am the king of the jungle." The boy's laughter erupted, pure and unrestrained. Maya's eyes softened and Richard felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he had carried for years. For the first time since Clara's death, he played. He let himself be silly, ridiculous even for the sake of his son's joy. And in that moment, something shifted. That night, after Leo was asleep, Richard retreated to his study, but the memory of his son's laughter lingered. He poured himself a glass of scotch but did not drink it. Instead, he sat by the window staring out at the garden bathed in moonlight and allowed himself to remember Clara. Her laughter, her hands brushing leaves from Leo's hair, the way she had believed in joy even in sorrow. He closed his eyes and for the first time in years he whispered her name aloud. "Maya," he murmured to himself afterward, testing the sound of it in the silence. Not as a command, not as a servant, but as something far more. She had given him back a piece of himself he thought lost forever. In the days that followed, Richard's transformation deepened. He began spending more time with Leo, not as an observer but as a participant. He sat beside him during meals, encouraged him with gentle words, even read aloud when Maya placed a book in his hands. It was awkward at first, his voice rough, his patience thin, but Leo responded. Slowly, cautiously, the boy began to look at his father, not with fear or distance, but with curiosity. One evening, as Richard read aloud from a storybook, Leo reached out and placed his small hand over his father's. The gesture was simple, fleeting, but it left Richard shaken. He finished the story with a voice that cracked, his vision blurred by tears he did not bother to hide. Later, when Leo was asleep, Richard found Maya in the hallway. She was tidying a vase of flowers, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the sconces. He paused, unsure how to speak the gratitude that filled him. "You've given me my son back," he said quietly. Maya looked up, startled. "I haven't done anything extraordinary, Mr. Langston. Leo has always had this in him. He just needed time. And someone to see him." Richard shook his head. "No, it is extraordinary. I thought I had lost him. I thought I had lost everything, but you've shown me that he's still here, that I can still reach him." His voice grew thick, "that I can still be his father." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Maya's eyes softened, and though she said nothing, the look she gave him was enough. It was not pity, Not condescension, but something gentler, a recognition of his struggle, of his attempt to be more than the hollow shell grief had left behind. It was then that Richard realized the truth. He was not only awakening to his son, but to himself. He had spent years entombed in sorrow and ambition, but Maya had forced light into the cracks. She had stirred in him not just admiration, but the courage to hope again. And though he did not yet speak it aloud, he knew that his world, the empire he had built, the fortress he had maintained was no longer enough. He wanted something more, something human, something that began with the laughter of a child and the quiet strength of a woman who had been underestimated all her life. The test of loyalty winter arrived with a merciless chill that blanketed the Langston estate in frost. The gardens, once alive with color, now lay silent under a thin layer of snow. The fountain in the courtyard had frozen into a sculpture of ice, and the bare branches of the oaks rattled against one another like brittle bones. Inside, fires burned steadily in the grand hearths, but the warmth of the flames could not completely drive away the biting cold. For Richard, however, the change of seasons meant more than a shift in weather. It marked the quiet progress of his son and the shifting tides of his own heart. Leo was thriving in ways no one had thought possible. His words, though still soft and halting, grew more frequent. His laughter, once a rare sound, now echoed through the nursery almost daily. He even began to reach for his father more often, seeking comfort not only from Maya but also from Richard. The bond between them, fragile but real, was slowly being rewoven, and at the center of it all was Maya, steady, patient, unwavering. She had become a fixture in their lives, a presence so constant that Richard could no longer imagine the house without her. But peace, as Richard knew all too well, was always fragile. It happened on a gray afternoon when the snow had just begun to fall again. Maya had taken Leo into the garden for a short walk, wrapped warmly in scarves and gloves, hoping the crisp air might soothe him after a restless morning. The boy clutched her hand tightly as they wandered along the path, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes bright. For a while, everything seemed calm. Then, without warning, a loud crash shattered the stillness. A gardener had dropped a metal tool against the stone pavement. The sharp clatter rang out, startling in the quiet. Leo froze, his body stiffening as panic rose in his eyes. Maya knelt beside him instantly, murmuring softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just a noise. You're safe." But fear had already taken hold. With a sudden burst of energy, Leo wrenched his hand from hers and bolted down the path, his small boots slipping on the ice. "Leo!" Maya cried, leaping to her feet. She chased after him, her heart hammering in her chest. The boy was fast, his panic driving him forward blindly, and the snow made the ground treacherous. He slipped once, scrambled back up, and kept running, straight toward the frozen fountain. Maya pushed herself harder, her lungs burning in the icy air. "Leo, stop. Please, baby, stop." Her voice was desperate, but she knew he could not hear her through the storm of fear inside him. His world had narrowed to escape, to the need to run from the sound that had shaken him. She reached him just as he skidded near the fountain's edge. His foot caught on the icy stone, and he toppled forward with a cry. Maya lunged, her arms wrapping around him, pulling him back just before his head would have struck the frozen marble. They tumbled together onto the cold ground, snow dusting their coats, her body cushioning his fall. She held him tightly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's okay," she whispered over and over, rocking him against her chest despite the freezing cold. "I've got you. You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you." For several long minutes, Leo struggled against her, his body rigid with panic. But gradually, her voice, her warmth, and her steady embrace began to reach him. His breathing slowed, his cries softened, and finally he clung to her, his small hands fisting in her coat as he buried his face against her neck. Maya closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks, relief flooding through her like warmth in the cold. By the time Richard reached the garden, alerted by a frantic staff member, Maya was still kneeling in the snow, holding Leo tightly. Her hair was damp with melting flakes, her hands raw from the cold, but she would not loosen her grip on the boy who had nearly slipped from her grasp. The sight struck Richard like a blow. For a moment he could not move, could not breathe. All he saw was Maya, cradling his son with a devotion so fierce it seemed to shield him from the very winter itself. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "He's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's safe." Richard dropped to his knees beside them, his hand brushing Leo's hair, his other hand reaching instinctively to steady Maya's shoulder. His chest heaved as he took in the scene. The snow clinging to her lashes, the red marks on her hands from the cold, the way she clung to Leo as though she would never let him go. "You saved him?" Richard murmured, his voice breaking. Maya shook her head. I just did what anyone would do." "No." His voice was firm now, heavy with conviction. "Not anyone, you." He helped her to her feet, though she staggered slightly from exhaustion. Without hesitation, he slipped off his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders, his hand lingering just long enough for her to feel the warmth of his touch. Then he scooped Leo into his arms, holding the boy close, though his gaze never left Maya's. That night, after Leo was safe in bed, Richard sought Maya out. He found her in the small kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes distant with fatigue. She rose when he entered, instinctively as though expecting orders, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Please," he said quietly, "sit." She hesitated, then obeyed. Richard sat opposite her, studying her in the dim light. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes tracing the faint bruise on her cheek from the earlier accident, the rawness of her hands from the cold, the weariness that clung to her yet could not disguise her strength. "I have built an empire by trusting no one," he began slowly, "by believing that loyalty is always bought, never given freely. And yet tonight, you prove me wrong." His voice cracked slightly. "You would have risked yourself, your safety, your life for my son. You didn't hesitate." Maya lowered her gaze. "He's just a little boy. He doesn't deserve fear. He deserves someone to fight for him." Richard swallowed hard, his throat thick. "And you've been that someone when I could not. Do you understand what that means to me? What it means to see my son held like that? To know that you would never let him fall?" Her eyes flicked up to his, uncertain, guarded. "I only did what love demands, Mr. Langston, even if it isn't my place." Richard leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "It is your place. I see that now. You are not just a maid in this house, Maya. You are the reason my son is smiling again. You are the reason I am learning how to be his father. And tonight, you reminded me that loyalty isn't measured in contracts or salaries. It's measured in the courage to stand when others would falter." Silence filled the kitchen, heavy but charged. Maya's eyes shimmered, torn between disbelief and the fragile hope his words stirred. For so long she had carried herself with quiet strength, expecting nothing in return but the satisfaction of having done right. To hear him speak with such raw conviction unsettled her, yet it also warmed her in a way she had not felt in years. At last, she whispered, "I would never let him go." "Not ever." Richard's gaze softened, his expression unguarded in a way it had never been before. He reached across the table, his hand resting lightly over hers. "And I will never forget that." For the first time, the barrier between them cracked, not through anger, not through guilt, but through the undeniable truth of loyalty proven in the snow. A new beginning spring arrived slowly, but when it did, it painted the Langston estate in colors that felt almost miraculous. The snow melted, revealing grass eager to rise again. The fountain, once encased in ice, now gurgled with clear water, and the oaks stretched out new leaves that shimmered in the soft light of the sun. The estate, often a fortress of silence and cold grandeur, seemed to breathe again. Yet the greatest renewal was not in the gardens or the fountains. It was in the people who lived within its walls. Leo had blossomed in ways that astonished even those who had doubted. His words, though still halting, came with more frequency. He could ask for things now, simple requests spoken softly but spoken nonetheless. He laughed often, sometimes even initiating small games with his father, tugging his hand toward a toy or placing a block in his palm as though inviting him into his world. His progress was fragile, imperfect, but it was undeniable. Every step forward carried with it the sound of possibility. Maya remained at the heart of it all, steady as ever. She continued her work with quiet dedication, never seeking praise, never claiming credit. Yet within her something had shifted too. The humiliation she had once endured in that house had not vanished, but it no longer defined her. She held herself with a dignity that even the most resentful staff could not ignore. Whispers had grown quieter. Some had even turned into hesitant respect, for though they might resist, none could deny what they saw with their own eyes. a boy once closed to the world now blooming under her care. And Richard, he had changed most of all. The man who once drowned his grief in work now rose earlier to have breakfast with his son. The man who once measured time in contracts and profits now lingered on the nursery floor, laughing awkwardly as Leo pushed toy cars into his hands. The man who once built walls of pride and fury now walked softer, listened more, and carried his power not as a weapon but as a responsibility. His empire still demanded him, but he no longer let it consume him. He had rediscovered what mattered most: fatherhood, family, the fragile bonds of trust. It was not a sudden transformation, nor was it without struggle. There were days when grief still ambushed him, when the memory of Clara's laughter would rise like a ghost and leave him hollow. There were moments when patience frayed, when his temper threatened to resurface. But each time, he found an anchor in Maya's steady presence, in the reminder of what was possible when one chose tenderness over anger. She had become not only his son's guide, but also a mirror for his own humanity, reflecting back the man he could still become. The turning point came one afternoon in early May. Richard had invited a small group of colleagues to the estate for a luncheon, more out of obligation than desire. They gathered on the terrace overlooking the garden, sipping wine and discussing market strategies and acquisitions. Yet even as they spoke, Richard's attention drifted to the site beyond the glass doors. There, on the lawn, Maya sat cross-legged on a blanket, her hair caught by the spring breeze, her laughter carrying faintly through the air. Leo sat beside her, stacking colored blocks into an uneven tower, his face lit with concentration. Every so often he looked up at her, as though seeking approval, and she responded with gentle encouragement, clapping softly when he managed to balance another piece. The scene was so ordinary, so simple, and yet to Richard it was extraordinary. One of his colleagues followed his gaze and smirked. "Still letting the maid play therapist, Richard? Surely by now you've hired someone more professional." Richard turned, his expression calm but unyielding. "She is not just the maid," he said evenly. "She is the reason my son has found his voice again. She is the reason I have found mine." His tone left no room for argument. The remark silenced the table. For the first time, Richard did not care what they thought. His empire would endure or fall on his decisions, but his son's future depended on loyalty, patience, and love. And those things, he knew now, were worth far more than any fortune he could amass. Later that evening, after the guests had gone, Richard found Maya in the garden. She was gathering the toys, her hands careful as always, her eyes thoughtful. He approached quietly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, and for a moment simply watched her, the way she moved with both strength and gentleness, the way she belonged in the scene of renewal around them. "Maya," he said softly. She looked up, startled, then straightened. "Mr. Langston?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "Richard, I think it's time you called me by my name." She hesitated, her lips parting as though the words caught in her throat. "Richard," she whispered finally, and the sound of it unsettled him with its quiet intimacy. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You've given me back my son. You've given me back myself. I can never repay that, but I can promise you this. You will never again be treated as less than what you are in this house." "Not by me, not by anyone." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though she fought to hold them back. "I never asked for anything in return. I only wanted Leo to feel safe. And because of that," Richard said, his voice thick, "you've given us both something I thought was lost forever: hope." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of leaves and the faint sound of Leo's laughter drifting from the terrace. It was not the silence of distance, but of understanding, of two people who had walked through fire and found themselves changed. In the weeks that followed, the Langston estate no longer felt like a fortress. Its walls still gleamed, its halls still echoed with wealth, but within them now pulsed something warmer, something real. Leo's progress continued, and though challenges remained, he faced them no longer alone. Maya's place in the household grew secure, not because of a title or a contract, but because she had become indispensable, not just to Leo, but to Richard as well. And for the first time in years, Richard Langston allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by loss but by love. A future where healing was not a dream but a daily act, built from trust, loyalty, and the quiet courage of those who refuse to give up. a future where a billionaire, his once silent son, and the woman who had been underestimated by everyone but herself could stand together, not as employer and servant, not as broken souls bound by tragedy, but as a family forged in the crucible of pain and transformed by the resilience of the human heart. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, and as the first blossoms of spring opened in the garden, so too did the possibility of a life renewed, richer than all the wealth the Langston name could ever hold.